Hello, America. Welcome. It is Eric Erickson here across the United States of America. Well, we've got controversy. We've got a trade court decision on Donald Trump. And of course, the Trump team is out screaming activist judges. It's not nearly as activist a decision as some of you might believe. Did you know that the trade court didn't get rid of all the tariffs? I bet you haven't been told that. Let me explain this. The United States has a trade court. It is headquartered in New York City, and it is trade experts. In fact, one of the judges in this particular case was a Donald Trump appointed judge. There were three judges. One was a Reagan appointee, one was a Trump appointee, one was an Obama appointee. They have unanimously ruled that the president's global reciprocity tariffs exceeded his authority under something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That was enacted in 1977, and it allowed presidents to declare emergencies, and in those emergencies enact tariffs. Now, this was premised, the law was a revision of a prior law that Richard Nixon had used to impose tariffs in the early 1970s. And what the court said yesterday is that the global tariffs exceed the scope of the law. The plain text of the law actually allows the president to impose limited tariffs on limited targets. What the president instead did on Liberation Day, and by the way, if you were listening to me on that day, I told you that the reciprocity tariffs probably violated the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. A lot of people say, no one's ever, they pulled this out of their butt. No one's ever said this. I literally, on this radio program on Liberation Day, said the president probably can't do what he's doing under the emergency powers. And all these people, they clearly need to be listening to me because I said on that day it probably exceeded the scope of his authority under the law. Because the law is very clear that the president can impose broad tariffs, but they've got to be limited to targets and limited in their scope. And these are, in his words, retaliatory tariffs designed for two things. What? To repatriate industry to the United States and to increase revenue to Washington and possibly help with taxes. That's not an emergency. That's a change in public policy. A trade deficit is not an emergency, and Donald Trump cited the trade deficit as an emergency. The judges accurately note that all a trade deficit is who sells more to whose country. That's it. And trade deficits go up and down based on economic measures. That's not an emergency. Let me read you some of the quotes from the court. The worldwide and retaliatory tariffs lack any identifiable limits and thus fall outside the scope of the International Emergency Economic Act. President Nixon imposed a limited surcharge and a temporary measure calculated to help meet a particular national emergency, which is quite different from imposing whatever tariff rate he deems desirable. A finding that the president has the power to impose whatever tariff duties he deems desirable simply by declaring a national emergency would not only render our trade agreements program nugatory, it would subvert the manifest congressional intent to maintain control over its constitutional powers to levy tariffs. So Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution says the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. The Congress, not the president, shall have the power. Duties. Tariff is considered a duty. Now, Congress has delegated limited authority to the president to act in emergencies expeditiously that allow congressional review. And the Trump administration argued that because Congress could review his emergency tariffs and chose not to, that he's complying with the law. What the judges said is that Congress cannot, under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, give to the president their power entirely. Any power conveyed to the executive under Article 1, Section 8 has to be constrained within reasonable bounds. And the court said it's not a reasonable bound to tell the president that you can impose tariffs willy-nilly up and down, depending on your mood, when you wake up in the day, how you feel on everything. And that's not unreasonable. And all of you who are upset would be cheering this on if Barack Obama or Joe Biden had done it. What the court also noted, however, and this is where many of the headlines got lost, is that the president has separate powers to impose category tariffs. The president can impose tariffs on steel, on aluminum, on car parts, on pharmaceuticals, on microchips. The president has designated categories that he can impose tariffs on in a separate law. The category tariffs are not under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It's a completely separate law that the president can use for category tariffs. And this court, if it was an activist court, probably would have said, no, you can't impose any tariffs like this. But this court said, we can't touch the category tariffs, not in this lawsuit at least. We can consider them by other means, but the president does have the power under separate laws to do category tariffs. Congress has allowed him to do category tariffs. He just can't do global blanket reciprocal tariffs based on a trade deficit. That's not defined as an emergency. Now, contrast this with what a district court judge in Boston has done. A district court judge in Boston has told President Trump he's not allowed to undo immigration waivers on the classes of immigrants that Joe Biden gave. The tariff power is a power of Congress under the Constitution. The review of immigration is an executive power under the Constitution and the laws of Congress. The judge in Boston noted that, yes, the president has this power, but the judge has decided to exercise judicial review anyway. Again, that's different from the tariffs because the tariffs are a power explicitly designated to Congress, and Congress can give limited amounts of its power to the executive. In the immigration case, it's undisputed based on the Constitution, federal law, and Supreme Court precedent. Two things. One, the president oversees and enforces the immigration laws of Congress and is allowed explicitly to grant or reject waivers to classes of immigrants. And two, one president is not allowed to bind another president. In the tariff case, the judges unanimously said, listen, the president can tariff categories of goods, but he can't give blanket tariffs under the Emergency Powers Act. He's got to actually define a limited emergency and give limited tariffs. Global tariffs that are unlimited, that go up and down based on his whim, that's not limited to an emergency. The judge in Boston says, yeah, the president has the power, but I'm going to exercise my judicial review anyway. And my judicial review says that this president is bound by the former president. That's in violation of constitutional precedent and law. One president cannot bind the acts of a future president. If a future president wants to change public policy that a former president implemented, he's allowed to do so. That's an activist judge. Now, I know it doesn't matter because we're in this tribal age where my side gets what it wants or else it's illegitimate. And Trump supporters, they're yelling at me for saying this wasn't an activist trade court decision. They're yelling at me. They're yelling that this is an assault on imperial judiciary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I want to give you perspective on this. Barack Obama, when we had a 5-4 Supreme Court that included Justices Kennedy and John Roberts, Barack Obama lost in the Supreme Court 23 times unanimously. Not a single person on the right was screaming about an activist court at the time. In fact, when Joe Biden was regularly losing before the Supreme Court, and when Donald Trump was given pretty broad immunity from prosecution by the Supreme Court, nobody on the right was screaming about an activist federal court. When conservatives use district courts to block Joe Biden and get nationwide injunctions, no conservative was screaming about activist courts. But because it's now being applied to Donald Trump, the right is now doing what the left did. The left was screaming about activist judges. Now the right's screaming about activist judges. No one really cares about the truth. It's just what my tribe wants. I had a woman this morning say that this is why she no longer listens to me regularly, because I had the audacity to say, of course, this was a reasonable decision on tariffs, and the president can only be an activist so far. Yes, the president can be an activist, but that activism comes within the bounds of the law. That's why I don't listen to him regularly anymore. So I've got an opening for a new listener, preferably with a higher IQ, than the woman who's upset because her views were not being affirmed, that the president is a dictator who can do whatever he wants. This was a good decision. And if it was rendered against Obama or against Biden, all of you people upset today would be cheering it on. But because it's Trump, you're like, that's an activist judge. They literally allowed category tariffs to go into effect, saying they have no power to stop them. An activist court would have stopped those tariffs too. And here's the thing. And again, I said this on Liberation Day, and the court broadly makes this point. Had Donald Trump applied the tariffs to China and to Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, where often China just sends goods to Vietnam so they can be imported into the United States and labeled Vietnamese, had Donald Trump done that, he would have won the case. And it's clear from the language of the court. Donald Trump would have won the case had he done what everybody told him to do and stick it to China. Instead, he decided to stick it to everyone broadly everywhere, including countries where we have a trade surplus with them. Looking at you, Australia. And the court said you can't do that under this particular statute. If you're going to use a statute, you have to comply with the plain language of the statute. And the plain language of the statute doesn't allow for broad, global, universal tariffs where the rate can change on the whim of the president of the United States. That's all the court said. In fact, in the process, the court was very clear that you're allowed to do category tariffs and we can't stop you. Contrast that with the judges who are stopping on immigration, where they're largely saying, hey, the president has a pretty unlimited power when it comes to regulating immigration, but we're going to stop him anyway. Those are activists. Can you not discern this? That one is based on the plain language of a statute and the other are judges literally saying, yes, this president has the power, but we don't think he's implementing it fairly. That's not what the trade court said. That's what the immigration judges are saying. The immigration judges are using their sense of fairness to restrain a president from something he has full power to do. The trade court's just saying Congress didn't give you unlimited power to impose tariffs. They let you do it in certain ways, and you got to follow the law when you do it. Ultimately, the court is giving Donald Trump a way out of the mess that he himself has created. Tariffs are bad, and they're raising prices. Your prices are starting to go up at Walmart and Target and elsewhere. We just got economic numbers. The country's actually doing better than expected, but still shrunk by 0.2 of a point. If it does it 2 quarters in a row, that's technically a recession. And I realize Joe Biden tried to redefine a recession to say that's not so, but that is so. He's got the opportunity now to recalibrate these and focus on just China. That's what he should have done to begin with. Make it all about China, China's unfair trade practices, rally the EU and the Western world against China with tariffs. But he chose not to do that. He chose to go after everyone, everywhere, all at once, with wildly disparate tariffs, with math formulas that didn't actually make any sense, and even went after countries where he had trade surpluses with them. It just doesn't work that way under this particular law. He can find another law, or he can ask Congress itself to impose tariffs, which he hasn't done. But spare me the outrage over this being some sort of activist decision. I realize we're in a postmodern world and no one cares about the truth anymore. It's just my side, it's my truth, and my side wants this. It's very tribal, but truth should triumph over tribe. And the truth is, this court was so restrained, it said, we can't stop him on these other tariffs, but on these, he doesn't have the power under this law. That's far different from like the judges on the immigration cases saying, yeah, he technically has these powers, but we think he's not nice, so we're going to stop him. There's a big difference there. And if you can't see it, you're too broken by politics. And maybe you need to unplug a little while from politics. And as for those of you who are mad at me for telling you the truth about this decision and say, I'm never listening to you again, I'm fine with that, Simple Jack. We can open our listenership up to a broader audience and take new listeners.
Have something to say? Hello. Call the show. 1-877-97-ERIC. That's 1-877-